So, up in Dundee, there's a rather unusual ship. You can see here, it's an age of sail ship, no prizes for guessing that, but it's missing a few bits and pieces, isn't it? You know, where's the masts gone? Where's the rigging? To be fair, you can also have HMS Victory at the moment, but she's undergoing conservation and preservation. But this ship never had masts fitted. There's also a bit of a chunk missing out of the side there. So what's the story with that? Why is it in the state that it's in at the moment? And why is there a seagull? And why am I flying a drone that's bouncing all up and down the place because the wind is trying its level best to smash it into the water? Well, all of those questions and more will be answered in this video, because this, as I said, is a rather unique vessel. This is a frigate from the immediate post-Napoleonic War era, but the reason there's a socking great roof on its head is because this ship has never actually sailed in combat or even in peacetime. It was launched straight from the shipyard into ordinary, and it's stayed that way, i.e. in reserve, ever since. So what's its story? Let's have a look. So, what's the story of HMS Unicorn? Seagulls aside. HMS Unicorn was the 9th ship to bear the name. Given that she is now in Dundee, in, of course, Scotland, it's somewhat ironic that the very first Unicorn was not an English ship, not a ship of the Royal Navy, but a Scottish ship. Henry VIII's Royal Navy then captured her, brought her into service as HMS Unicorn, not obviously this ship, and that started a long line of unicorns. There have been 11 total in Royal Navy service, of which this is the 9th. So she's a representative of the Leda or Leda class frigates, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and there are 2 still in existence, Unicorn, which is where we are now, and Trincomalee, it's a little bit further south. Now, why is Unicorn so special? Well, you might notice I'm standing on the upper deck, but I'm also indoors, which is great. So this is because, unlike pretty much any other surviving age of sail ship, Unicorn was launched straight into what was called ordinary, which today we would call reserves. Now, the way you would put a ship of the line or a frigate, basically any kind of age of sail warship, into ordinary is you would cover over the upper deck with a roof, and you would either take out the mast if you're putting the ship into ordinary from active service, or in Unicorn's case, you would just not install the mast because the ship was launched without the mast. They'd be fitted out later. And uniquely, Unicorn never actually entered service. So this roof, or a variant thereof, has always been here. Now, why is that? Well, simply put, Unicorn was built at the very end of the Napoleonic War. She was launched in 1817, a couple of years after they'd ended. Now, at that point, the Royal Navy had quite the embarrassment of ships and was trying to get rid of them as fast as humanly possible. But they still had to maintain a fairly large fleet, not quite the same size as the wartime fleet, but still. And so the oldest ships went straight to breaking up. The slightly newer ships, usually war-built, and maybe some of the ones that are in better shape from shortly before the Napoleonic Wars, were mostly kept in service. But the brand new ships, like Unicorn, were put straight into ordinary. Now you might think, well, why is that? That seems silly. Why put your latest and greatest ship straight into reserves? Well, simply put, wooden ships, if they're properly maintained, keep really well in reserves. So the idea of putting the newer ships into ordinary was that the newest designs of ships could be preserved as long as possible and in as good condition as possible for the next war. The older ships, the ones that Unicorn and her sisters were designed to replace, would be kept in service during peace. They'd wear themselves out, and eventually they'd be broken up, and then maybe some of these ships would be brought out of ordinary and put into service. But it meant that when a war came, the Royal Navy would actually have the best and most modern fleet that it could possibly possess. So that was a good idea. But as it turned out, time marched on. There wasn't any war in the early 1800s, apart from obviously the Napoleonic Wars that had just concluded, as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, that actually called for any large number of ships. By the time you got into a war where the Royal Navy was fairly heavily committed, the Crimean War, Unicorn had been in ordinary for several decades, and newer, much larger frigates with much heavier guns had come into service. And even though the Crimean War was a fairly major commitment, it still didn't mean that the Royal Navy was committing its entire fleet. And so Unicorn, which had become a depot ship down on the Thames and was mostly full of gunpowder, stayed where she was. Shortly after the Crimean War came the age of iron and steel, at which point there was no point in trying to bring Unicorn back into service, because the new, latest and greatest technology was ironclads. She wasn't an ironclad. She wasn't big enough to be converted into an ironclad. And in the long-distance overseas stations, where perhaps ironclads weren't going to be used initially, again, they had bigger and newer frigates. And so Unicorn trundled on, becoming a training and depot ship. Now, that necessitated her move from London up to where we are now in Dundee. Because at the time, the way the Royal Navy would recruit and train people was quite simple. Rather than recruiting somebody from, let's say, the north of Scotland and saying, right, well, now you've got to make your way down to Dartmouth on the south coast, they would have ships like Unicorn positioned at strategic cities and towns, and if you volunteered for the Royal Navy, you would be brought aboard, and here is where you would receive your initial training. It was also quite useful because obviously the Royal Navy had squadrons of ships based all around the UK, which then meant that if you were trained on a ship like this, you could be sent over to a ship nearby rather than having to go all across the country at his, or at the time her, Majesty's expense. And that's what Unicorn did for the entirety of her 19th century existence, and then well into the 20th century. Now, you might be wondering what these are behind me. These are the battle honours, because as I mentioned, Unicorn was not the first and not the last Unicorn that would enter service. So although the frigate, HMS Unicorn, that we're standing on never saw active combat, a number of her predecessors did, and of course in the late 1930s, the aircraft maintenance carrier HMS Unicorn was commissioned. So temporarily renamed HMS Cressy, this ship lost that name, that Unicorn took up the name, and that's why we have the Salerno 1943 battle honour just over there. Once the aircraft carrier went out of service, this ship reclaimed the name, and there would be one final Unicorn, an Upholder class submarine, but that was then sold on to another navy, so HMS Unicorn, this frigate, stays as she was. Now, you might notice there's a couple of small carronades here. These are fairly small ones. There's some much bigger 32-pounders over the other side, which we'll see in a minute, and those are the ones that she would have mounted on this upper deck, but you can see the upper deck gun ports. Now, there's a very clear distinction to be made here. Slightly oddly enough, Unicorn was built in a manner, at least on the upper deck, that was actually somewhat more reminiscent of an old-school Tudor galleon than what you might think of as a late 18th, early 19th century sailing vessel. And that's because if you go aboard HMS Victory or USS Constitution, the two surviving ships from that slightly older design period, you'll notice on the upper deck there's either very minimal or even no gunwales or gunnels, depending on how you want to pronounce it, protecting you from going over the sides. There might be netting, but at best any solid barrier is going to be maybe knee high. On Unicorn, however, these structures go up significantly higher. So you can see we've got the green section, that would be there, but also if the period drawings are accurate, and there's no reason to believe they're not, then those timbers would have gone up to probably here or here. So effectively enough to hide behind, even for someone like myself. And this structure would have extended along up to this point, where you can see now there's a shelf, but back on the original designs there would have been a gap here. And this is where the guns that were positioned here on the upper deck would have temporarily finished. And then as we walk further back, you'll see right up there at the bow, it restarts again. So there would have been a smaller structure there which would have had a handful more guns, including the bow chasers. Now, one of the unique things about the name Unicorn in the Royal Navy is that it's almost invariably associated with a frigate. Only the aircraft carrier from World War II and the submarine thereafter broke with that tradition. But you can see all the way going back to 1544, there's basically a small galleon Unicorn. And then you have the 1748 Unicorn. This is the 7th ship to bear the name, and another slightly different variant thereof here. Now, there aren't any models that I can see of the immediate predecessor to this Unicorn, which fought during the Napoleonic Wars, but there is a model of the aircraft carrier just over there, and there's a few other artifacts which we'll have a quick look around now. So this is the current ship's bell. This is not the original ship's bell. As you can see, this is HMS Unicorn 1942. This is the aircraft carrier's bell. And the reason that this one is here is because obviously the World War II Unicorn was a big aircraft carrier, or technically aircraft maintenance carrier, effectively used as an aircraft carrier. And as a result, it had a much larger, much more impressive bell. So once that Unicorn went out of service, this Unicorn decided, all right, we're having that, and here it is. And then the original ship's bell got sent off to be sold. Now, it does say you can ring it, so of course that's what we're going to do. Well, you're going to hear that for a long distance. So we're now on the port side of the upper deck, and here we can see a pair of the 32-pounder carronades. So these are the primary armament of the upper deck of the ship. This was coming about during the Napoleonic Wars on Royal Navy ships because the carronades were a lot lighter than cannon. They were shorter range, but it did mean that whereas the upper decks of ships used to maybe have a handful of 9-pounders or some other lightweight long gun, when the Carron Company down in Falkirk invented these, originally actually for merchant ship defence, the Royal Navy cottoned onto them as a way of adding quite a considerable amount of close-range firepower for relatively minimal weight increase. And to be perfectly honest, at a very long distance, a 9 or 12-pounder ball probably wasn't going to do all that much anyway, so the lack of those, apart from at bow and stern chaser positions, wasn't really a fantastic loss. And obviously, they're very, very powerful as at close range, but their short barrel, which contributes to their light weight, means that they couldn't really be used all that much at long range. Now, whilst the Royal Navy had the technological advantage in this regard for most of the Napoleonic Wars, because, well, the Carron Company had invented them, and in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy wasn't exactly going to allow them to be sold to the French. The Americans in the War of 1812 took up the idea of carronades in a very big way, and this accelerated the much wider scale deployment of carronades in the Royal Navy to the point that on a Leda class frigate like Unicorn, there would be a considerable number of them up here, and that's why we have this much more significant built-up upper deck structure as opposed to on older ships. You'll also notice that unlike the ships of the line, there is no poop deck. So this would, if you didn't have the roof here, would be entirely open to the air flush all the way along, which is why the captain's cabin is down there on the gun deck. Now, there are a couple of interesting points when it comes to Unicorn, apart from the fact that she was never actually formally commissioned and stayed in ordinary the entire time. She's also probably one of the oldest ships, if not the oldest ship, to receive the surrender of an enemy warship in the Second World War, believe it or not. And no, she didn't sail out and capture something on the high seas, although that would have been a fantastic story. Rather, a late model German U-boat ended up sailing into Dundee and surrendering to a Royal Navy ship because it saw the white ensign being flown, and it just so happened that that ship was HMS Unicorn. So yes, technically speaking, an early 19th century sailing frigate took the surrender of a late model German U-boat. So I guess this means sailing frigate beats U-boat in some circumstances. Oh well, never mind. Now, the reason for the white ensigns present here is because, of course, there's a roll of honour on the wall commemorating the men who were on HMS Unicorn, both in the First and Second World War, who then obviously finished their training, went out to sea, and gave their lives in those conflicts. So you can see here the roof of HMS Unicorn in much better detail. Now, this is obviously the roof that was put on when she was put into ordinary. It's not the original roof. The roof was replaced several times and repaired even more than that, because of course it's the bit that takes the most wear. Now, of the old sailing ships that we still have around, so Trincomalee, Victory, Constitution, Unicorn herself. Unicorn is by far the most complete in terms of her original structure. She only really ever had one set of major repairs in the 1850s and 60s when she was moved up from being a gunpowder store in Woolwich to being a depot and training ship in Dundee, which means that almost the entirety of her timbers are 19th century, and the significant majority are actually original 1817. So if you want to see what a late 18th, early 19th century design ship looks like, because of course she's a meld of the two techniques, then she's one of the best, if not the best, to come and have a look at. All those other ships obviously do retain significant elements of their original structure, but they've all been under significantly greater and more extensive refits over time, which is perhaps somewhat understandable because Unicorn didn't really get around all that much, and so she had much less wear and tear than the other ships did. Also, because she was in ordinary with the roof over her head, a lot of the weathering that would have gotten down into the ships, the other ships that we mentioned, didn't get into her, so she's been able to last that out considerably better. She is, however, now, 200 plus years after she first hit the water, in need of a bit of an overhaul, and the organisation that looks after her are indeed working towards that goal. So here we are on Unicorn's main gun deck. Now, it's also Unicorn's only gun deck in the formal sense. There are some guns one deck higher on the upper deck, but that is not a full-length gun deck, nor is it covered. So on a ship like HMS Victory, a first-rate ship of the line, you would find 3 full covered gun decks. On Victory, depending on what time in her career you're looking at, that would consist of an upper gun deck of either 12 or 18 pounders, a middle gun deck of 24 pounders, and a lower gun deck of 32 pounders. The single full gun deck on Unicorn contains these things, 18 pounders. So her full broadside is roughly equivalent to a ship of the line's upper gun deck broadside, or possibly slightly heavier if it's a time period where they're using the 12 pounders. But of course, whether you're looking at first, second or third rates, time period size can vary. But it gives you some idea of exactly why frigates wouldn't engage ships of the line into straight up fight in, say, a full-size sea battle, because whilst they might have been rated for 30 or 40 guns, you might think, oh well, therefore, 2 or 3 frigates might be the equivalent of a ship of the line. The guns themselves are considerably lighter than a lot of the shot that we're flying back at them. Now you'll see over here we have the gun ports as well. Now this gun port is approximately the size that it would have been at the time that Unicorn was launched. However, as we keep going around the ship, you'll see that a number of the gun ports are quite different, and that's part of the legacy of Unicorn being a training and depot ship for pretty much the entirety of her active service career. Because as men came aboard and needed to be trained, obviously they needed to be trained in the latest armament. So new guns would be brought aboard, and those new guns had different heights, different traverses, very different capabilities to an age of sail 18-pounder cannon, and thus the gun ports where those guns were installed were expanded and bits cut out of the side of the ship to make room for them. The other thing you'll notice, which you won't see on something like Victory, or if you're in the States, USS Constitution, are these things. This is part of the legacy of the designs that were evolving just after the Napoleonic Wars. We'll see another example of that a little later on when we're in the captain's cabin, but briefly, the sheer volume of ships that had been created for the Napoleonic Wars had pretty much denuded the Royal Navy's stockpiles of timber and most of the forests where new timber could be gotten. And remember, unless you want your ship to only last a handful of years, you don't build it out of softwood, you don't build it out of greenwood either, you have to season the timbers. So it does take time both to grow trees of the right size, then treat and season the timbers, and then only then can you build a ship out of them. Now, given that there was a very big gap between when large numbers of timbers would be available and the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, they faced a bit of a problem, because if you built a ship out of short timbers, then the ship was very likely to work itself apart incredibly quickly. And 2 major developments came across. the Sepping system and the Simmons system, both named after their respective inventors, and they were combined in the Royal Navy. And one of the changes they made were these things, as we said. These are iron braces and iron knees, and they're all over the ship. And the idea of this is it means that the entire ship, near enough, apart from maybe the keel and some of these longer timbers for the frames, but the rest of the ship can be made out of much, much shorter timbers, thus saving the long timber stocks and thus allowing the Navy to still build large numbers of ships without completely exhausting their seasoned timber supplies. Because, of course, the iron strapping meant that the ship suddenly became a lot stronger. The other thing that you might notice is over here, diagonal cross bracing. This was again done using the short timbers, and that combined with the iron strapping to make the sides, actually, as it turned out, between them, stronger than they had been when they were just built out of single timbers. But that's enough about this gun. There are a couple of others. We'll see a few higher up on the gun decks. Now, there are some other guns to look at. There were 9-pounders and 32-pounder carronades that were designated for the upper deck, but we'll have a look at those when we go onto the upper deck. But over here, there's another type of gun. This is a mortar. So for those of you wondering what a shipborne mortar looked like, well, this is a relatively small example, made of bronze, as many mortars were at that point. And as you can see, it has no wheels, just has these little spokes, so it can be lugged around by 2 to 4 men, probably 4 men because it's quite heavy. And as you can see, it's not exactly the world's longest barreled weapon. Yeah, that's pretty much the extent of it. These are obviously used in sieges, has a little touch hole here, and the purpose of the wood block is partly to allow for some of the absorption of recoil. It's got a little bit of a hinge here so you can change the elevation, but a small mortar like this could be used on a ship like Unicorn, or it could be taken ashore as part of a landing party, and this obviously is to fire shot and shell over things into defences. Basically useless as an anti-shipping weapon unless you're firing at ships at anchor in a port, but if you wanted anything much bigger than this, then you would have to have a bomb vessel, and a bomb vessel was a small ship that had an entire section of the bow specially strengthened to take the recoil of the much larger mortars. So put that cover back on. Now, this is some of the ammunition that was fired. As you can tell, there's quite a wide variety of it. We have some solid shot here. This is the 18-pounder shot. So after the 64 and 110 pounders I picked up on Warrior, it's not exactly that heavy. Although apparently the ship disagrees. Here is some bar shot, chain shot, another kind of chain shot. This one is solid as opposed to this one is hollow. And over there you can see a much bigger round. That's a shell. And that reflects both the fact that there's mortars available, and later on, bearing in mind that the ship is built immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, shell guns definitely become a thing. So the shells, explosive shells, you can see the top there would be filled with explosive and then plugged. These are the weapons of the latter part of the Age of Sail, as opposed to the classic Nelsonian period where you'd just be firing solid shot and this wonderful collection of objects at each other. And here we are on the starboard bow part of Unicorn's gun deck. As you can see, more 18-pounders behind us, and as we keep walking backwards, hopefully without me either bashing my head into the ceiling or tripping over a gun, which has been known to happen at various times, you can see the actual gun ports go all the way around to the bow chaser position, but there is no bow chaser gun because, of course, this last gun would be able to be repositioned. You can see the bowsprit there coming down as well, and obviously the guns continue down the other side. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that, like HMS Victory's upper gun deck, you can just about, he says, walk straight and level. Now, I'm on a good day 6 foot nothing, and most of this gun deck is traversable by me, but the gun decks, or in fact all the ship decks on this ship, do actually get noticeably lower as you go to the bow and stern. So this area, as long as I'm standing between the beams, I'm fine, but if I try and walk into the beam, well, that's a good way to lose a few brain cells. But as I come closer and closer, by this point, I can, well, I'm now touching. If I just stretch, I can touch, but at normal walking pace, I don't actually have to duck. And then here we are. Welcome to the captain's cabin. this is basically the only other part of the main gun deck. It's just guns from bow to stern, little bulkhead divider, and then we're in here. Now, as you can tell, it's a little bit echoey, but this is the only, as I say, accommodation, as again, opposed to on a ship of the line where on the upper gun deck you might have multiple areas of accommodation, dining rooms, etc., etc. Here it's just captain's cabin and that's it. Now, one of the things you might notice here, which you can see internally, and we'll later see also externally, is the shape of the walls, because this was the other half of the advances that I mentioned. Because if, again, you look at HMS Victory or USS Constitution, the old school style of ship design had the frames and the main hull of the ship come back, terminate, and then do a kind of 90-degree across the back. And that stern section really didn't have much in the way of structural support capability. It was mostly there just to keep the water out. As a result, it was usually very heavily glazed and not particularly heavily built. Now, that could be a problem if you got raked. Now, being raked fore or aft was never a good thing, but especially aft, where there was basically nothing to stop the incoming shot and shell later on. It would just go straight down the length of the ship. With the advances that Seppings and Simmons made, and again you can see the iron ribbing here as well, it also led to what was called a round stern. I will now cut in some external shots so you can see what that looks like from the exterior. But the round stern was quite an advance because, one, it made the entirety of the stern structural and supportive, which helped to increase the length of ships, as it would later go on to happen in the 1830s through to the 1850s. But it also meant that, aside from the massive windows, for the first time there was a degree of protection against raking fire from aft, because now these aft timbers were just as thick as the timbers at the sides. This wasn't going to help you much at all if someone raked you right up close, much the same as if someone shot a broadside at your side right up close. The hull timbers aren't going to help it all that much, apart from maybe generating a bunch of splinters. But it did mean that longer range raking fire might be stopped or at least somewhat slowed down, especially if it was from lighter guns, such as in a frigate action. Paradoxically, despite all the advantages that this offered, many naval officers, when the round stern was introduced, didn't like it because they didn't think it looked as nice as the big flat glazed sterns of earlier ships, and for a while ships went back to having that purely for aesthetic purposes, but eventually, for structural reasons mostly, and also because the Admiralty just got fed up of people complaining, they instituted the policy that round sterns would be the future from then on. Now, bearing in mind that Unicorn is coming into service, or to be honest, straight into ordinary, in 1817, just after the Napoleonic Wars ended, this is one of the earliest examples of this kind of technology being implemented. So we're now down here on the mess deck. So unlike larger ships of the period, where you might have the crew eating, sleeping, etc., all between the guns, whilst some of the crew might do that, on a single gun deck frigate there simply isn't the room. So a lot of the crew would be down here, one deck lower. On this side of the ship they've set it up with the table, so we're on the port side at the moment. And as you can see, by the fact I'm having to stand a bit skew-if, the deck has dropped quite considerably. It's about 8 to 12 inches shorter than it was one deck higher. So I'm going to sit down before I get a crick in my neck. And as you can see, we have wooden tankards for food, your square meals, your square wooden plates, and of course some of the crew relaxing and having fun. Now, the other thing that's key to bear in mind, the reason there's a model ship here, is that the men would entertain themselves as well. So you're not just work, sleep, eat, work, sleep, eat, work, sleep, eat. You would actually have a reasonable amount of free time if you chose not to sleep for 8 to 12 hours at a stretch. And there's an awful lot of maritime and naval artifacts in museums that were made by the crew whilst they were waiting for something to happen. Now, obviously, Unicorn never sailed into battle and didn't sail at all, to be honest, but the crew that were assigned here would also have free time, so having a model here is quite appropriate, as it's something that they may very well have made out of bits of scrap wood and other things that they could scavenge. Now, once again, having found myself a nice bit of space to wedge my head into, on the starboard side of the ship, we can see how the crew would have slept. So we've got some hammocks rigged up here, and you can see how they're attached to the beams of the ship. Either end, there's these rings here. Now, the reason I'm slightly panting is because it's actually quite energy intensive to walk around here bent double whilst trying to carry all the camera equipment. Nevertheless, the sign does actually say try out one of the hammocks, so let's do that. Let's see how well I might fare as a sailor trying to get into a hammock. It does also say that it's a bit more difficult to get out than in, so potentially this could end up quite embarrassing or amusing, depending on which side of the equation you're on. So, that's actually not bad at all, to be fair. Nice gentle rocking motion. Probably should be about a foot that way, but never mind, I've currently got my head on the ropes. But yeah, I can see this being quite comfortable. I might set one of these up at home. Now, of course, the interesting thing is getting out. Oh, right, okay. Well, it turns out I can get out of a hammock, at least one at that level, relatively easily. So sorry, no random falling this time. Although I do suspect, given the way that was rotating right at the end, that if that had been slung somewhat higher, I may well have fallen out. But, you know, now, such is life. Here, at the stern of the deck below the gun deck, I'm at the head of the table for the officers. Now, paradoxically, this is called the gun room, even though this is basically the officers' quarters and contains no guns. Now, as I mentioned in other parts of the ship, the bow and stern areas of the deck do get considerably lower, to the point that obviously on the gun deck I can walk around the middle of the gun deck no problem. Bow and stern, there's a little bit of a risk of knocking my head, and you saw back when I was over at the hammock and eating areas that, you know, finding space was a little bit difficult. But now we're pretty much at the stern. In fact, you can see the stern behind me, complete with the ironwork that makes the ship strong enough despite its relatively short timbers. Now, I'm currently sitting right under a middle beam, and that's the reason why I'm sitting, and you'll see why in a second, because if I stand up, yeah, hello, this is not conducive to long-term cranial health, so not the easiest of areas to live in if you happen to be slightly taller, but, you know, we're below the waterline, so it's probably a nice regulated temperature here. Off to the right and to the left and behind us are all the individual cabins. They're not exactly the height of luxury, but they are private, whereas everybody else is either going to be up on the gun deck or just ahead of us. And this is one of the cabins that the officers would have occupied. So you can see very basic small desk there on the left, sea chest on the right, a few drawers underneath their bed, and the bed itself all up against the hull there. And again, more of the iron strapping. So not exactly world-ending levels of comfort, but to be fair, there are hotel rooms these days that are smaller and less comfortable. And now, once again, you find me wedging myself into a nice, neat part of the hull, because this, just at the stern, this is actually the tiller for the ship's rudder. So if the ship had actually gone to sea, obviously normally you would have steered it from the steering wheel you would have seen up on the upper deck, but in the event of that being shot away, as might happen in battle, this would be the auxiliary steering position. So you can see the ropes attached to it, so those would have led up originally to the steering wheel. But in the event of that being incapacitated, you'd need quite a lot of men down here, which is why this is quite so long. But using a combination of the ropes and the physical iron tiller, you could actually maneuver the tiller to steer the ship if someone was yelling commands down from on high. Of course, there is absolutely no way on earth that one person can move it. So, Yeah. And we're now in the lowest part of the ship. You can probably tell that, you know, by the time the timbers reach the point where they're actually intruding on the height of the camera tripod, the ceilings are pretty low. In fact, the ceilings are now low enough that I'm behind the camera, and if I stand to my full height, I'm actually hitting the upper timbers even though I'm between two beams. Now what you can see in front of us is the absolute lowest portion of the hull and some of the store areas. So again, whereas on a larger ship of the line, these kind of store areas might be a portion of one of the below water level decks, this is pretty much almost the entire bow to stern area. You can see through the slats there, the bow is present. You can just about see some of the iron ribbing there, and behind us is probably only about 20 foot to the stern. Now, there's some of the ropes laid out there. You can see they are obviously spare ropes for the sails and rigging had the ship been fully sailed and put in under sail and rig. And down in the hull itself, you can also see some of what's now the ship's ballast, big lumps of metal. This is used as opposed to the stone ballast that would have been more common at the time period. One, because it's much easier to do point load corrections with these much heavier bits of ironwork. And two, because it's denser and therefore you need less of it by volume, it means the hull itself can be accessed and treated and dried out. So you can see just to the right there, there's a little pump because there is a little bit of water ingress. It is a wooden ship. You can't really do much to avoid that. But it also affords a very good opportunity, a very rare opportunity, to see some original lower hull timber work under the Sepping Simmons style. So you can see we've got some fairly big timbers, because this is one of the areas where they would use the short supply of large timbers, making up the ship's frame and some of the ship's beams. But you can also see there some of the diagonal cross bracing being done with ironwork, although this ironwork is somewhat more rusted than the ironwork further up, which is understandable. But you can also see over there to the left one of the long ribs that's running along the length of the ship, you see, is not a solid piece of timber the way that it would be on a slightly older ship. It's actually made up there of several shaped bits of timber, and there you've got the joint just at the bottom left, again reflecting the use that even here they are using somewhat shorter timbers than you would prefer to use otherwise. And here we reach what I think is the lowest portion of the ship, not physically, the keel is still about 8 foot below, but lowest in terms of overall height for people, because this is adjacent. This is one of the two passageways adjacent to the rope storage area. So you could see one of those from where we were a moment ago. And unlike those areas, although we're actually amidships, this obviously has a actual built-up walkway, and the deck is made up able to take loads. So it's actually even narrower, and you can see I'm on my knees, and even so I can just about clear the beams. If I stand, yeah, I'm still bent double and I'm smacking my head into the ceiling there, so that is quite the low section of the ship, but still a fairly interesting section of the ship, because it brings you right up close again with more diagonal and vertical iron bracing work, and gives you an idea of just what it would have been like to try and live and work on this ship. Because whilst, yes, Unicorn is always a training and depot ship, sister ships of the Leda class did actually go out and sail. So, you know, if you think being on a ship of the line is a bit cramped, try being on this. And just for the record, the reason you can see a beam right there in the top is because the poor tripod, which is about 4.5 foot, is about that far off hitting a beam directly above it. So yeah, quite the cramped area. Here we are at the bow, and in the lowest part of the ship again. Slightly disconcertingly, I don't know if the microphone can pick that up, you can actually hear the water sloshing past. It is a very weird sensation. Anyway, so this is the bow. You can see everything narrowing to a point, and again, more ironwork. And in this case, unlike the previous ironwork, which is all vertical and cross member to support the sides of the hull, you can see here there's a series of kind of W-shaped iron straps which run what's now basically the full width of the hull, and they run obviously from starboard side, and then they come up over the keel and back across the other side. And once again you're treated to the fact that all of these beams considerably shorter than what you'd expect to find on your average ship. So this one, for example, runs from the bow to about there, so it's maybe 12-15 foot long, and then there's another timber run with probably about the same length again up behind the camera before going off, and then continues down the ship. Now, believe it or not, as you might be able to see, I can actually stand here. It's about the only place on the lower deck I can stand, and that's purely because the deck here is dropped down about 2 feet to meet the hull rising. So further back in the ship, you had the lower part of the hull where the ballast would have been, and then a deck kind of almost mezzanine above it, whereas here I'm quite literally, there's maybe a 2-3 foot of oak between me and the water. So it's nice and cool, which would be good in the summer months. Not entirely sure how it would be during the winter, although I suspect the amount of water around us would probably maintain the temperature relatively evenly. And it's a fairly nice dull sound area as well, so pretty good for recording if it wasn't for the constant water sloshing noises. So the magazine, if the ship had gone into action and was firing its guns, the magazine is just here, the outside of it. Obviously that would have been full of gunpowder, and indeed for the first few decades of its life when it was down at Woolwich was full of gunpowder, but then so was the rest of the ship, so it didn't stand out all that much. So let's go somewhere else. Okay, so we're back on the gun deck, so we can actually stand up again, which is great. And of course we've looked at Unicorn, how she came about, what her history is, some of the features of the ship, but what's going to happen to her now? Now obviously my period of historical expertise kind of reaches a screaming halt around 1950, which means I'm not particularly au fait with modern ship preservation techniques or methods, and so what better thing to do than to talk to someone who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to this. So give everyone a quick introduction.
Hi, so my name's Matthew Bellhouse-Moran. I'm the current museum manager on board HMS Unicorn. I've been a maritime museum curator and manager for about 5 or 6 years now. I'll hasten that I'm not an expert in boats, but I am an expert in stopping large things falling apart.
Which is quite useful considering we're on a large thing. So what are the current plans to preserve Unicorn?
So HMS Unicorn is still in the water, and it's very unusual that a ship of this age is still in the water. And obviously modern conservation practice is that the amount of cost and uptake and replacement of original fabric that requires to maintain is untenable either in the medium or the long term. So very fortunately, even though we're pretty much trapped in this dock in Dundee, we're trapped in a dock that has a graving dock about 20 metres behind it. So the plans are to get HMS Unicorn into the dry dock, into the graving dock, put a concrete caisson in and pump the water out, and have Unicorn in the dry supported on a cradle. Now that's a huge capital project which will come along with a visitor centre and museum and all that sort of thing, and is planned at the moment as part of the wider development of the Dundee dock area, which is being considered by the council. The Unicorn, in preparation for that, because that's going to be huge grant bids to funders, has actually managed to raise about £100,000 in the last year or two to undertake photogrammetry, sonar, laser surveys, an entire timber survey's been done. So every single wooden member on the entire ship, except for those which are on the outside and underwater, which is fair enough, has been tested by a shipwright, by a company called Nielsen's, for how rotten it is. They delivered to us a 500-page document listing the quality of every single timber on board the ship. Then that was fed into a structural model, which used all of that information, and we have had from our structural surveyors, structural analysts, some indicative modelling that shows the stress points on the ship and how the ship is coping. The good news is that the ship cosmetically looks very poor, but the timbers that are completely lost on the starboard side are actually Victorian replacements. And the actual structure of the ship, so the frames and everything, are actually in very, very good condition, and the ship is structurally sound. It doesn't look good, but it's structurally sound. So that's all really promising, because of course that's what you need to be able to say when you go to a funder and they want, you want a couple of million quid off them, and they say, yeah, but is it going to last? We can now say yes, it is. It is a viable option. So that's what we've got planned over the next 2 to 6 years. It's going to be a lot of work. We are a small charity. We have 2 full-time employees, but it's looking good at the moment. We're fairly confident.
And of course, more recently, for those of you who are unaware, there was a similar survey done on HMS Victory down in Portsmouth, and they found that the hull was effectively sagging around the relatively sparse supports that she'd sat on for near enough, almost 100 years at that point. And so if you go and see her now, she's supported by multiple smaller supports, which gives her a better lease in life, which is quite good, because obviously with them discovering that before, I guess that means when Unicorn goes into the graving dock, knowing that in advance, she'll be able to be supported in the best way from the start.
So we actually coming late to the party of having a historic ship out of water onto a support is actually playing to our advantage, because we do have the data, or not the data, but the expertise now available to those contractors that dealt with ships like Victory and Great Britain, all those large ones that need that specialised hull support, because of course there's nothing as efficient as a support structure than floating in water. There's just nothing that really replaces it. But we do recognise that the risks of drying out a vessel, because it will take many years for the vessel to dry out of water, and the support are all necessary risks, because the risk of staying in the water now is getting too high. Yeah,
and as you said, the exterior timbers, they're not in the world's best condition at the moment, but if the ship had ever gone into active service, those kinds of things would have been replaced multiple times over, and with the wear and tear of being at sea, probably significant portions of the interior as well during medium and large repairs, which, as I mentioned earlier, Victory, Constitution are pretty much the only 2 sailing warships that are largely intact that are older than Unicorn. Trincomalee is obviously a sister ship, and both of them, they've got some original timber, they've got a reasonable amount of original timber, but you can also start making ship of Theseus arguments, especially with Victory. Whereas, as you said, the majority of this structure is original, and it sounds like what's coming off is probably the stuff that was refitted to her shortly before she came up to Dundee anyway.
Yes, and again, part of the problem with having this be run by a very small charity is that the ship's not been in a graving dock, in dry dock, since the 1970s, because the costs are just far too large for us to bear. But it's all part of the plan of becoming a properly accredited museum and visitor centre, and organisational restructures and reviews, so that the charity itself is now better placed than it's ever been to take this project on. So as I said, we're all pretty optimistic. We've got support and rumbles of support from all the correct quarters at this point, which is extremely encouraging. And the support locally is immense. Dundonians love this ship. It's their ship, perhaps much more than other historic ships, because it has been in the one city for 150 years. And people will come and say, I've been to weddings on board Unicorn and parties. We were known as the party ship for a time, because you used to be, until relatively recently, used to be able to hire it out for any kind of shindig that you wanted. So the support is there. The statistics and the data are now there, because all of that survey work has put a lot of received wisdom to bed about how the ship's hogging and how the ship's changing. And we can now look at this data, and we now understand the ship better than ever, including since when it was built. And we can put a lot of the more wayward theories away now and just move on with facts, which is really helpful.
Yeah, I suppose it also shows a fair degree of credit to the Royal Navy constructors who designed and built her over 200 years ago. The fact that she's, apart from a few minor touch-ups here and there, effectively just been sitting in the water for 2 centuries and is still pretty much with us.
I mean, it's really interesting that the reason that Unicorn survives to the state that she does today, which you know, it's cosmetically not great, but interior is superb, is a combination of things which were inherent to the ship. So the fact that she's had the inordinary roof for 200 years, and the over-engineering from Robert Sepping's, so the extra bracing and diagonals and the ironwork, the circular stern. Unicorn is a very over-engineered ship, which, when you start to fall apart after 2 centuries, is excellent because it gives you a bit more time to plan and a bit more breathing room to save the vessel.
Yeah, I suppose it does, and it really does show, because there's an awful lot of Victorian era stuff that's still around, which has stuck around long after intervening stuff, especially ships that have been built and that have subsequently fallen apart. I mean, you mentioned Great Britain earlier, which is of course also a Victorian era ship, Warrior as well, and whilst Unicorn obviously is somewhat older, she was at least in the care of the Royal Navy for a good portion of her life, whereas Great Britain was basically an abandoned hulk in the Falklands, yes. And Warrior was a semi-abandoned oil jetty over in Pembroke. So yeah, and for those of you who already know, obviously I'm an engineer by background, so at some point if someone corners me and gets me to go on about Joseph Bazalgette and all the London sewer systems, Britain pretty much runs on Victorian technology that has refused steadfastly to fall apart, whilst all its successors have gone horribly to pieces. So it's really good to see Unicorn still here. Thank you very much for that insight, and of course people can still come and visit her.
Yes, absolutely. We are open 4 days a week in winter and 6 days a week in the summer. But obviously check out our website for details. Have to say that because it does change. And we are bounding back, recovering from COVID, but obviously visitor figures aren't what they used to be, and we are dependent on that revenue. So if you've always thought about visiting but you haven't yet, get on a train to Dundee, bring your friends, bring your family, pay the gift aid. It really does help. But that's my piece done there now. So I've done my bit.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, if you are thinking of coming up, as you say, you know, the train is 5-minute walk that way. I came in by aircraft because I'm A, lazy, and B, I live in West London, so I wasn't going to spend the entire day on a railway. But you know, flights into Edinburgh Airport, X90 Express bus, you know, conceivably you could do it as a day trip.
Yes.
I chose not to because, again, I don't particularly fancy getting up at 4 in.the, but you know, Dundee is not in the Outer Hebrides or anything like that. It's perfectly accessible, and it's a perfectly nice city as well. So definitely come and see Unicorn. And yeah, if you have any photos that you take while you're here, obviously feel free to drop me a message by email or Discord, and we can see about coordinating a Unicorn Visitors Award or something for the channel. All right, thanks very much, and see you later in another video. And so there's a quick tour of HMS Unicorn. I do highly encourage you to go and have a look if you can. Obviously, as mentioned just then, please check the website for the opening times and days, but it's definitely worth a visit. And here, as you can see, in a rare moment of calm wind on that particular day, you can see Unicorn as she is at the moment with her rather fetching roof. A little bit of storm damage there, but also you can see in the background there the dockyard where hopefully she will be once all the renovation is completed. A fine bit of naval history.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.